Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We're trucking along through the Gospel of Matthew. I had intended to get through more material today, but as I was preparing for this, and I had a busy week too, my dad had surgery and all of that, which I appreciate the prayers for that, by the way. He's home, and he's doing pretty well. Better, I think, than we expected, which is good. But we're going to only cover 4 verses today. CJ's going to give me grief for going so slow, but if there's anything besides maybe the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus itself, if there's anything to zero in on more, it would be what we're going to look at today. So we're still in Matthew chapter 26, and we last week studied Jesus eating the Passover with his disciples. And so what we're going to look at today is taking place in the midst of this meal, in the midst of the partaking of the Passover. They are reclined and they're eating, and you may recall this dramatic scene that happens where Jesus tells them that one of the disciples, one of them is going to betray him. He had told them periodically throughout Matthew's gospel account, he's going to be handed over, he's going to be delivered, he's going to be crucified, but he's going to rise on the third day. But now he tells them it's going to be one of them that's going to betray him, and it, of course, is going to be Judas. And there was the really climactic moment at the end of what we studied last week in verse 25, where the betrayer and the betrayed one are facing off. And in verse 25 it says that Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" This is after Jesus had said, "One of you will betray me, and it would have been better if he wouldn't have been born." And Jesus said in response, "You have said so." So there's this really climactic scene that's going on here. And just for context, this is what this would have looked like. Perhaps this is a depiction of what it would have looked like to have been reclined at the table. We think of reclining and we think of kicking back in a recliner with our feet up and heads back and probably a good position to take a nap. But this is an intimate way to share a meal together, being reclined at tables such as this. And it's in this situation is where Jesus has just revealed that one of them will betray him. And it is still in this context where Jesus will institute the Lord's Supper. Before we read this, I'll have the verses on the screen. We'll look at it in a little more detail that way. But notice something that's absent in Matthew's gospel account. And Jim pointed this out a little bit in his sermon last week about the better supper in comparison from Luke's account. The remark, "Do this in remembrance of me," if you look at the Lord's table here, it's written there. It's in kind of King James language. "This do in remembrance of me" is what it says on our table. But this quotation is not found in Matthew's account. In fact, it's not in Mark's account either. It's only in Luke, and then Paul references it in 1 Corinthians 11. And so Matthew makes no mention of them doing this other times. He just simply mentions the fact that Jesus has this with the disciples there. And what this is showing us, as Matthew is depicting this story, is instead of looking forward to the weekly partaking, which of course we still do to this day, we'll do later on, but Matthew is looking backward, and what he's doing is he's linking this supper, the Lord's Supper, with the supper that they were already in the midst of taking, which is, of course, the Passover supper. And there's a lot of connections that you could make with that. Jim did a good job of doing that in his sermon last week, so I won't go in as much detail with some of the connections that you can make between the Passover and the Lord's Supper. But instead, we'll just look at this in detail. We'll just let the text explain itself, and let's see what Matthew has to tell us here. So let's start with Matthew 26 and verse 26. It says, "Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.'" Notice that it says that they're eating. What it is they're eating, again, is they're eating the Passover. This began in verse 20, and actually it sort of began in verse 17, where the disciples come and they want to know what they can do to prepare the Passover. So the Passover has been on our minds really actually since the beginning of the chapter, when in verse 2 Jesus foreshadowed, and this is a couple days earlier, he foreshadows what's coming when he says in verse 2, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. That Passover is now here. They're in the midst of eating it. And this is, of course, the day that he'll be betrayed, which we'll cover on a later date. And so they're eating, and what they're eating is the Passover meal. And what we see happening here is while they're eating, Jesus takes bread. This bread that he takes, if you don't know the context, this might get lost on us. But the bread that he's taking is, of course, the bread that they're eating with the Passover, which is unleavened bread. We get that from Exodus chapter 12, and it's mentioned several times as the Passover is instituted in Exodus, that this is unleavened bread. And we'll look at Exodus 12 and verse 15 on the screen in just a moment. But have you ever wondered why when we take the Lord's Supper, we use unleavened bread? Well, this is the reason why, is because this is the bread that Jesus used when he instituted it. And so we do things the way that the Bible says to do it. And when Jesus took bread, it was unleavened bread. And so that's why when we take the Lord's Supper, we use unleavened bread, because that's what Jesus used when he instituted it. And this is among the places where the unleavened bread is mentioned in relation to the Passover. This is from Exodus 12 and verse 15. It says, 7 days ye shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses. You can't have any leaven in your house at all. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. And so it was very important for the Israelites, when they ate the Passover, it had to be unleavened bread. There couldn't be any leaven in it whatsoever. And we know this language is used in the New Testament somewhat frequently. Just a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Paul mentions that in 1 Corinthians. And so it's important that they did this without leaven. And the idea behind that, when you study the context of Exodus, is to make haste and get out of there, because they're leaving Egypt and going eventually to the Promised Land. They don't have enough time for that leaven to kick in and so on. So we read that he took bread, and it says after blessing it, he broke it, and he gave it to the disciples. If you've been reading Matthew's gospel account, especially maybe if you're reading it, say, in one setting, then this language would probably sound pretty familiar. It should sound familiar, because this is very reminiscent, this particular language, of the two feeding stories in Matthew's gospel account, the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000 from Matthew 14 and Matthew 15. The times where Jesus feeds the multitude. Matthew records it twice here, the feeding of, I think it's the 5,000 first and then the 4,000. I might have that mixed up. But we read of these stories in Matthew 14 and in Matthew 15, and when you compare the language, it's very similar. They're almost parallel to each other in the sense that there is bread, there's a blessing, the bread is broken, and it is given directly to the disciples. And so in Matthew 14, it says, he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Well, here you see this similar language. He takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to the disciples. And in particular, when you compare Matthew 26 with Matthew 14, there are some really striking parallels in addition to some of these. And we touched on this a little bit when we studied Matthew 14, but I'll touch on it a little further here. There are a lot of parallels. You see on the last bullet point here what we just looked at. He took bread, he broke it, or he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to the disciples. There's also the idea here that in both contexts, it's evening. In 14 and verse 15 we read that, and in 26 and verse 20, when this whole thing starts, when they're initially taking the Passover, Matthew gives that time marker. When it was evening, he reclined at table with the 12. And speaking of being reclined at table, that's another parallel between Matthew 14 and Matthew 26. In the ESV, the version that I read from, the word that's used, I just had it on the screen. He ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Now that word, I think in most English translations, is translated as sit, or some variation of that perhaps. But the word that's used, it's not the exact same word as what's used in Matthew 26, but it can mean recline. And so this is another parallel, perhaps, that you could see here. They're sitting or reclined. It portrays an intimate sort of setting. And then, of course, there's the parallel that Jesus, he took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples. This is a striking parallel, and I don't think this is on accident. And then this is Matthew 15, just for good measure, to show you the other feeding story. Directing the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. So here again you have this parallel. He gives thanks, he broke it, he gave it to the disciples. This is a very striking parallel that Matthew gives us here. What I think is going on here is Matthew is showing us that just as Jesus had previously offered physical sustenance in the feeding of the multitudes, he's now showing that he's offering spiritual sustenance. And it's interesting, this is the idea as well behind John chapter 6, when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. Keep in mind in John 6 the context of that. He's just fed the multitudes, a parallel story with what we looked at in Matthew 14 and 15. And then he gets into about how he's the bread of life and eating of his flesh and drinking of his blood and so on and so forth after that. What we see here is Jesus, he had given them physical sustenance. Now he's going to offer them spiritual sustenance, which is, of course, himself, his own body. So he's blessed it, he's broken it, he's given it to the disciples. He gives them the command to take and eat. If you look at the original language here, the word take and the word eat are both imperatives. An imperative is a command. It's something to do. Matthew is the only one, out of all of the times that the institution of the Lord's Supper is mentioned, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and also in 1 Corinthians 11, Matthew's the only one who has the imperative command to eat and then to drink in verse 27. In Mark, the command is to take. And in Luke and in 1 Corinthians, the command, the imperative, is to do this in remembrance. It's interesting that Matthew is the only one that gives the commands to specifically eat and drink. And this is just for the sake of noticing it. This is from Mark 14, the parallel account in Mark. As they're eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to them and said, take, this is my body. He doesn't say take and eat. He just says to take. And then he said to them, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. In Luke 22, we noticed this last week in Jim's lesson. He took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Here's the command. Do this. That's the command, the imperative. Do this in remembrance of me. And then in verse 20, he issues the cup as well. And in 1 Corinthians 11, here he gives them the command to do this twice. He said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And then on down in verse 25, he says the same thing. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. So it's interesting that Matthew's the only one who gives the command to eat and to drink. This is looking back, of course, at the Passover. And what he tells them to eat is his body. He says, take, eat, this is my body. There's a lot of debate about what this means and the connotation behind it. Some will accuse the church of being cannibals because Jesus says to eat his body and to drink his blood and so on and so forth. Those are obviously misguided things. And you have the situation with the Catholics, which I'll touch on in more detail in a minute. But he says, to take and eat, this is my body. Well, what are we doing when we are eating of Jesus' body? He gives us the command to take and eat, this is my body. This is in reference to the bread. So what do we do when we are eating of Jesus' body? Davies and Allison, this is the commentary that I use a lot. They put it this way in reference to this, and I think this is a good explanation of it. They say the command to eat, followed by this is my body, implies participation in the death of Jesus or its effects. Just as those who partook of Passover shared in the redemption from Egypt, so those who take and eat share in the benefits of Jesus' atoning death. When you look at this in light of the Passover, and keep in mind the Passover is what they were currently eating as Jesus is instituting this, this makes a lot of sense. Because you look at what they were doing in that moment, they're eating at the Passover. They themselves weren't there, but they were reaping the benefits of the Passover to that day. Because the Passover was the culmination of them getting freed out of Egypt. I know it's really about them being passed over on that last plague, the plague of the firstborn and so on. But big picture-wise, it's the culmination of them leaving Egypt. That's kind of big picture what they are celebrating. And so they were reaping the benefits of that. And when you compare that to when we take the body of Jesus and we drink the cup of Jesus, it's the same thing. We are participating in the effects of the death of Jesus. And I think this is what Paul has in mind when he says this in 1 Corinthians 10. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not our participation in the blood of Christ? And the bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? That word that's used, that's translated as participation, it's the word for fellowship in the Bible. So you think of all that is implied with fellowship. There's a commonality to that, or a sharing in that. It's translated, the word is koinonia, I believe, and it means something that you have in common, something that you share. It's translated oftentimes as sharing. It's the word that Paul uses when he talks about sharing and suffering and so on and so forth. It's the same word. And so when you look at the participation in the blood and the participation in the body, we are sharing in the blessings that come from that, from the atoning sacrifice that Jesus is going to give. We today, when we take the Lord's Supper, in addition to all the other things we do, one of the things we're doing is we're proclaiming the effects of what Jesus has done, the redemption that He gives us. So He tells them that this is His body. This raises, of course, an age-old question. Is this literal or is this metaphorical? And the term that's used, the doctrine that the Catholic Church teaches, is the idea of transubstantiation. And that if you break down what that word means, you see what the doctrine teaches, is that the substance of the body and the substance of the fruit of the vine, it literally changes. This is what they teach, into the literal body and blood of Jesus. Trans-substance, you can kind of see it in the word. Trans, of course, means change. And then substance, you can see it in there. So is this literal or is this metaphorical? Well, some will say, well, the word is means is. That might be true in English, but this isn't the word that Jesus said or that Matthew wrote down. The word in the original language is the Greek word eimi, which is perhaps, I'd have to look this up, but I think it's probably the most frequently used verb in the entirety of the New Testament. Because eimi, it would be I am, you are, he or she, or it is, if it's an object and not a person. That word eimi is used a lot, several thousand times, I would assume. And it's ambiguous. Sometimes you can see that it's used in a literal sense, but oftentimes it's used in a metaphorical or a symbolic sense. And there's a lot of examples of this in the New Testament. Even in Matthew's Gospel account, there's a lot of examples of this. For example, in Matthew 5, Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, says, "You are the salt of the earth." That word that we translate as "are" is the word eimi in Greek. It's in the second person, so it's you are, not I am or it is, but you are the salt of the earth. Is Jesus saying that we're literally salt? No, it's a metaphor. You are the salt of the earth, and so on and so forth, and all that goes into that. Another example is when He's explaining the various parables in Matthew 13. Here He says about the parable of the sower, what was sown on good soil, this is, that's the word eimi again, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. Here He's attributing meaning. He's explaining the allegory behind the parable of what He's just talked about. And so here is another way that it's used in a metaphorical sense. And you could look also at John chapter 10. This is outside of Matthew. But You have this with the I am statements. That word I am is the word eimi. And he says here in John 10 and verse 7, I am the door of the sheep. Is Jesus saying he's a literal door? No, he's saying that he's the entryway that the sheep get to the Father, and so on and so forth. He's not a literal door. And so you can see that it's used frequently, not just literally, but also metaphorically. And so the argument that you will hear some use to say, well, the word is means is, that's not a good argument. You can't use that argument. You can get into nitty-gritty about other things, but that argument in and of itself is not a valid argument that you can make. When he says to take and eat, this is my body. Well, that raises the question, well, then what is it that Jesus has in mind when he says, this is my body? The key is to look at what it is he's talking about. What is it that he says is his body? It's the bread that he's taken and that he's broken and that he's given. What he's showing us here is that his body is going to be just like a Passover lamb. It's going to be broken and it's going to be given. It's going to be given as a sacrifice. This is what John the Baptist had in mind. We get this in John's Gospel account when he sees Jesus coming and he says, behold the Lamb of God who comes to take the sins of the world. This is what Peter has in mind. I might have that on the screen. I don't. But this is what Peter has in mind in 1 Peter when he talks about the blood of Christ like a lamb that's unblemished. Jesus is our Passover lamb, as Jim did a good job explaining in his sermon last week. We spent 20-ish minutes on one verse. Any comments or questions on any of that before we go on? Go ahead, CJ.
This is something you want to talk about.
If you're bringing it up, problem.
How do you reconcile Jesus saying broken and given, and then all the prophecies like in the Passover lamb expressed in Exodus 12 by the bone of it broken? Is he saying broken in spirit, or do you take that to be figuratively broken, as he's saying here?
CJ asked the question because Jesus says that he has broken it and he's given it, and yet there's prophecies, and you can tie this in with the Passover lamb. None of its bones were broken, and there's prophecies of Jesus as well that specify none of his bones are broken. So how do you reconcile that? You got to look at the way Jesus is using the word broke. He's dividing the bread is what he's doing there. This applies then to the amount of people that will be benefited by his sacrifice. It's not just for a specific group of people. It's not just for one person. It's for all people who will choose to accept it. So it's metaphorical, not in the sense of being broken in heart or broken in spirit or anything like that. Broken as in terms of being divided among all of humanity. When you look at how he's using it, that is what would make the most sense to me. Danny, you had something?
Well, I was just going to thank you, because I had cable about this morning, and I might have to do it now.
Just play this class. We'll be here a little longer, but... All right, verses 27 and 28. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. So he's done this with the bread. Now we see he takes a cup. And as Jesus has done with the unleavened bread, he does it now with the fruit of the vine. We read in other places, we know in connection with the Passover, that this is the fruit of the vine. Whether it's wine or grape juice or whatever, I don't think is relevant to what we're talking about. Although there's a lot of people who enjoy discussions on that, if it's fermented or not, so on and so forth. What's important here is, just as he's just done with the unleavened bread, now he does it with the cup. And if you notice, Matthew, his gospel account is very intricately structured. And not just from story to story, but even within stories in and of itself, there's an intricate structure. And we see a really good example of that here in the parallel between between Jesus instituting the unleavened bread and now the fruit of the vine. And Matthew, if you notice and if you compare the way he does this to the other accounts of the institution of the Lord's Supper, Matthew seems very intentional in doing it this way, making sure that the language parallels itself. And so here you can see it on the screen. I hope that's not too small for you to read. In verse 26, he took bread. Verse 27, he took a cup. It's the same word that's used. In verse 26, he blesses it. And in verse 27, he gives thanks. Not the same word, but it's the same general idea between blessing and giving thanks. Same general thing. Verse 26, he gave it to the disciples. We see that again in verse 27. He gave it to them, to the disciples. He gives the command in verse 26 to take and eat. He gives the command in verse 27 to drink of it, all of you. And then he says in verse 26, this is my body. In verse 28, he says, for this is my blood. Very, very striking parallel here. This is something that Matthew does pretty frequently, even from story to story. We've seen it already with the parallels to the feeding of the multitudes. And we even see it here between instituting the unleavened bread and instituting the fruit of the vine. So Matthew, I think, is very intentional with that. So he takes a cup and says he had given thanks. He gave it to them. The word that's used here that's translated as given thanks, in the Greek that word is eucharisteo. This is where the term Eucharist comes from. You might hear the Catholics, they call the Lord's Supper the Eucharist. There are other denominations that might use that term as well. This is where it comes from. It's the Greek word for giving thanks. He gave thanks, and he gave it to them. And so that's just an interesting tidbit to know. That's where the word Eucharist comes from, is this particular Greek word. Another thing that's interesting, it says he took a cup, he had given thanks, and he gave it to them. A lot they'll raise issues about how specifically Jesus would have given this to them. Did he pour it in their own cups? Because they're all eating. They would have had their own cups. So did he pour from his cup into theirs? Or did he pass his cup around and they each drank from it? You have one-cupper churches who do this. I don't think that's particularly relevant. I think that is what they would say is making a mountain out of a molehill. They raise an issue over something that doesn't seem to matter that much to me. But of course, churches and Christians have done that from the beginning. We've done that. But there are some who hold to this very tightly, that it has to be from one cup. I don't think that seems relevant, and frankly, it's kind of gross. So don't take offense if I don't want to drink after you. Yes?
Jim flashed in Luke, the 22nd chapter, if you go up to verse 17, it says, and he took the cup and gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among yourselves. That's how they were to take it, divide it among themselves. For some people say, no, you have to drink the whole thing. You have to, you have to drink, all of you drink out of one cup, etc., etc. But here he says, divide it among yourselves.
Yeah, in Luke's account of this, Jesus says, take it and divide it among yourselves. So that would seem to imply that they each took it from their own cup, but there are some who would still argue against that. CG, I don't have time. Is this about one-cuppers? Yes or no, is it about one-cuppers?
Yes.
But that's not relevant. Sorry. So he gives the command, drink of it, all of you. Again, that command is given in the imperative. Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant. One thing about Matthew, we've seen this all throughout the gospel account. We saw it a lot at the beginning, and we're seeing it a lot here at the end. There's a lot of, if not direct quotations from the Old Testament, there are a lot of allusions to the Old Testament. And really, this whole story is a big allusion to the Passover. But there are some pretty strong allusions here, in particular from Exodus 24 and Jeremiah 31, in terms of the blood of the covenant and just the mention of a covenant in and of itself. In Exodus 24, this is when the first covenant, the law of Moses and so on, is being instituted. And what we see here is Moses, he's sacrificed an animal, and it says he took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So the first covenant, the law of Moses, it's instituted with blood. And the Hebrew writer makes this case, and he ties it in with Jesus. Jesus institutes the covenant that we're under, the new covenant. He institutes it with his blood, which is what he's saying here. And the Hebrew writer, in making this case, he alludes to Exodus 24 and saying not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. So Jesus inaugurates this new covenant with his blood. That's what he's saying here when he says that this is my blood of the covenant. And some manuscripts and even some parallels in Mark and in Luke will say this is my blood of the new covenant. Well, new covenant makes one think, of course, of Jeremiah 31. This is something else that the Hebrew writer alludes to when you go through the book of Hebrews, and saying that there's a new covenant, that means the first one is obsolete, so on and so forth. But this makes you think of Jeremiah 31 and verse 31, where the Lord says, "The days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah." Jesus is the one who institutes this new covenant. And he does so, of course, with his blood. He says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Here's another allusion to the Old Testament, the language of his blood being poured out. To the Jewish reader, Isaiah 53 would be right on their mind. This is something that they would have been very familiar with, the messianic prophecy of Isaiah, the suffering servant who was coming. There's a strong allusion to this when it says there in Isaiah 53 and verse 12, "I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and the numbered with his transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors." This is a little off topic, but it's interesting. Jews today, they have no idea who Isaiah 53 is talking about. They'll try to make it apply to anything except Jesus. But it's pretty obvious when you read Isaiah 53, Jesus is the fulfillment of this. And Matthew, in showing what Jesus says here, his blood which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins, that's a strong allusion here to Isaiah 53, to this messianic prophecy. And so when he says this, "This is my blood, it's poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins," we see the result of Jesus' sacrifice. Earlier we talked about what does it mean to eat of his flesh and drink of his blood, to eat his body and drink his blood. What does that mean? The participation in all of that, the sharing in that, getting the benefit of that. Here we see the benefit. It's poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. That word "for" denotes the purpose. It's for the forgiveness of sins. This is what we are showing that we have when we partake in the Lord's Supper. We are declaring what God has done for us. We are sharing in the forgiveness of sins. Now, something that's interesting, Matthew kind of hinted at this idea very early on. The angel is speaking to Joseph in Matthew 1, talking about Jesus being born. And the angel says of Mary, "She will bear a son. You shall call his name Jesus." The Hebrew variation of that is Yeshua or Jeshua or Joshua perhaps. "For he will save his people from their sins." It's been hinted at already from Matthew 1 what Jesus is coming to do, what he will do. He's going to save his people from their sins. And now we're seeing how he's going to do that. It's been hinted at periodically. Now Jesus gives us some more details. He saves us by his body which is broken and by his blood which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Peter puts it this way. I did have it on the screen. I just had it later on. When he says, "Knowing that you were ransomed," that word ransomed, the idea behind that is a price is paid for you. You've been redeemed. You've been purchased. A price has been paid. You were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold. We think of silver or gold and we think that's pretty valuable. And it is valuable in our unit of currency and so on. But we weren't ransomed with that stuff. Not with that perishable silver and gold. But with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. It's by the blood of Jesus that we've been ransomed. That is the price that He paid for us. He's ransomed us, He's redeemed us, He purchased us, and the price that He paid was His blood, which, as He says, was poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Then we come to verse 29. And He says, I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. He says here that He's not going to drink of it again. This, in a nutshell, is another prediction of His suffering and of His death. This is the last Passover that He has. He's instituting the Lord's Supper. And He knows tonight He's going to be betrayed. And soon after, He's going to be delivered and be killed. But He will eventually be raised on the third day. He will ascend to the Father. And there will be a time when He will drink of it again. We'll get to that in a moment. But this, in a nutshell, is another prediction of His suffering and His death. His death now is imminent. We're inching our way closer to that. It is just right around the corner. He's not going to drink of it again until that day when He drinks it new with them in His Father's kingdom. I know I said at the beginning we're looking back at the Passover more than we're looking ahead. We're looking ahead, but not ahead to this week and next week when we take of the Lord's Supper. We're looking ahead now at what is commonly referred to as the eschatological banquet. This is how the Jews thought of salvation. They thought of heaven as being reclined at a table with the patriarchs, with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And we've seen this language used a lot in Matthew's gospel. And here we see another hint of it, foreshadowing to this banquet that will be at the end, when He'll drink the fruit of the vine new with His disciples in His Father's kingdom. This is looking ahead at that great feast that we'll have at the end. Reminds me of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11. We hear this referenced a lot. Danny, I probably am taking this from you too, from your table talk. He says, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. This is what we're waiting for. We're waiting for Jesus to come so that we can now take this with Him in His Father's kingdom when it's realized at the end. And this, of course, and Jim did a good job of foreshadowing this in his sermon last week with the marriage supper of the Lamb that's mentioned. In Revelation 19, the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. This is what heaven is depicted as in a lot of places, and you see this a lot in Matthew because it is a Jewish gospel. You see the marriage supper of the Lamb, the marriage supper of the bride and the Lamb. The bride, of course, being the church, the Lamb, of course, being Christ. And so this is what we're waiting for. We're waiting, as we are partaking of the Lord's Supper each and every first day of the week, we're proclaiming His death till He comes. We're waiting for Him to come so that we can take it with Him in His Father's kingdom. So as we close here, and you look at what we've studied here with the institution of the Lord's Supper, as Matthew depicts it, for Matthew's readers, heavily Jewish readers, what did Dr. McClarty say? It's both the most Jewish gospel, but it's also the most anti-Jewish gospel because it digs into the Jews so much. Well, this is the Jewishness of this. For Matthew's readers, the institution of the Lord's Supper, it has three tenses, and each tense has its own meaning. You could think of it in terms of we're looking back, we're looking in the present, and we're looking, of course, ahead. And so for Matthew's readers, which would apply to us as well as the initial readers, on the one hand, you have the past tense here, looking back, not just back at the Passover, but looking back at Jesus' suffering on the cross. If you're Matthew's readers and you're reading this for the first time, you're reading this after Jesus has died, and you're reading this after He's been raised from the dead. And so you're looking back not just at the Passover, but you're looking at what Jesus endured on the cross. And we see namely that His body was broken and His blood was poured out. This is what Jesus says about this before it even happens. And of course it happens just as He says. Then you have the present tense in the sense that as we're reading this, this is something we're still doing to this very day. We'll do it here in a short while, partaking in this meal and this supper to this very day. What this shows us is the church is still following the instructions of the King when He says to take and eat and to drink of it, all of you. We're still doing this just as Jesus has said to do it. And then, of course, there is the future tense of this, in the sense that we're awaiting not only Christ's return, we eagerly await that to come, but also the chance to eat this meal with him and to eat it new, as he says, in his Father's kingdom. We're eagerly awaiting this marriage supper between the bride and the Lamb. What a joyous day that will be. Any comments or questions? Thank you.